just really quickly, just wanted to highlight, so this lecture today wraps up chapter 5, the troubled 19th century. So we're going troubled 19th. So this is going to catch us up on Europe, the revolutions of 1848 specifically. So we're basically today moving from the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. What do the powers do after they defeat Napoleon? And then what happens in 1848? The Great Springtime of Peoples, the Revolutionary Period. Next week, the next chapter of Oloso and Willeford is, I believe, it's labeled Imperialism. So this chapter actually includes quite a few things, but I'm just going to put the chapter title up here, Imperialism. What's going on in that chapter is they're talking about the growth, number one, of empires, because as we're going to see, after 1815, yes, France will have some colonies, yes, the Spanish will have a colony or two, but really most of the globe is dominated and run by the British. This is a consequence of the defeat of French naval power and the Continental blockade during 1815. This is one of the things we said that allowed the Latin American states to revolt against the peninsula's rule and create independent states. The British controlled the high seas, and the British didn't want to directly rule those. They just wanted them to be inside of their economic sphere of influence, which is something that will persist. Some of you may know that in the early 1820s, I believe 1823 is the exact date, the Monroe Doctrine is promulgated in the United States, which said, hey, from here on out, we do not, Washington, want you, Europeans, setting up shop in the Americas. We'll stay out of your business in Europe if you stay out of our business over here. Now, as you might know, this was in part to help support the independence movements down there. They were saying, hey, don't come try and crush these independent republics, which are ideologically our kindred spirits here. You stay out of their affairs, you stay out of American affairs, and we shall stay out of your affairs. Actually, that was what my dissertation work was on. It was looking at how Washington responded to later European nationalist movements. This is something that we're going to be looking at today, and then we'll be looking at the consequences of it next week in the chapter on imperialism, because also what we're dealing with here is the creation of nation states in Europe. As we're going to see, when we start our lecture today, and when we end our lecture today, there's still not going to be an Italy. There's still not going to be a Germany. Italy will be unified and created in its modern form from the 1850s, and it concludes in the 1870s with the final capture of Rome. And then Germany, the creation of Germany, this starts in 1860s and is concluded in 1870-71. So actually it happens at the same time. And there's actually a reason for that. It's because the French government was acting as the Pope's protector. And during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, the French are temporarily immobilized by the Prussian military and are unable to defend the Pope. And that's how that happens. So that's sort of the road ahead. Then, the week after that, we have a chapter, I believe it is called The Great War. It's World War I. It's the World War I chapter. I'll just write World War I. They might call it the Great, they call it the Great War? That was what it was called at the time. The Great War, yes. They call it the Great War. That was what it was called by contemporaries, because it was unlike anything anyone could ever see. It produces apart from lots of carnage and death and stuff, and World War II, it also produces a phenomenal array of literature. If any of you are familiar with The American Lost Generation, the novels of people like Ernest Hemingway, who here is a Tolkien fan? J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings? That is what he's basing it on. He was there as an officer. Yes. So World War I, the Great War, that will be our one, and then that will lead us to our next exam. That will be the next exam. So the nice thing is that this all kind of forms a nice, neat narrative from the French Revolution, which is where we just came from, French Revolution, right here. This is where we've been, and we're going here. And essentially, if you want to think of it in terms of a neat, simple story to follow, what happened is the French create a modern bureaucratic nation state. That means a professional bureaucracy, a society based on merit, one that identifies a state with a specific people, state with nation. Remember, previously, it was the ruler has this personal territory, and you are all subjects of that ruler. And the rulers, you know, when they had a war, they might get together, they often did get together at the end, and they would, as part of the peace settlement, they'd swap some territories. They'd just swap, and it wasn't controversial. It wasn't like, oh dear, my heart, I can't believe that. And the people weren't like, oh my God, no, beloved king, don't leave us here with this other king. Because it was just like, yeah, that's just what happens. Now, all of a sudden, the idea of trading some part of the sacred nation, the motherland, this is unspeakable. You can't do that. All of a sudden, territory is going to become critically important to identity of the state, and that is because these are not just subject peoples; these are critical parts of the nation. So there's also a process going on of building nations, because as we talked about in the French Revolution, you know, the French were pretty well on their way to nationhood, and this was in part a product of the state-building efforts of people like Louis XIV, the Sun King, the previously longest reigning monarch in European history, to standardize and centralize power. But even so, at the start of the revolution, we talked about how the language that we call French today, Parisian French, was spoken by a very small minority of people. And so you had this process of the revolutionary governments and the Napoleonic governments sending out attendants into the provinces, setting up schools, standardizing administration, taxes, language, education, all of this stuff. And that was one of the big projects of the public schools. The 19th century is the great era of the public school. And it was set up in order to inculcate the proper patriotic values that a citizen is supposed to have, to teach you the language and to teach you the common mythology of the state. So that's very true of the American system. The American system of public schools was set up to take all of these Catholics, tons of Catholics were just swamping the country. And so the Protestant establishment said, well, we have to teach them to be good, proper, patriotic Americans, which Americanism was very closely associated with Protestantism. This was true well into the 20th century, because it was thought that Catholics were not real Christians. They were, just dopish slaves of the Pope. That's why, how many of you know John F. Kennedy, only Catholic president? He had to go on national television, this was in the 1960s, and swear that he would not take orders from the Pope. So it says there was actually a party called the Know-Nothings, and this was in the 1840s, 1850s, that they almost became the other major party. They were eventually defeated by the Republicans. So we had the Republicans and the Democrats. It would have been interesting if we had had the Democrats and the Know-Nothings. So Donald Trump represents the Know-Nothing party. I don't know, it's kind of an interesting name. But so state with nation, so making these things, standardization. And by this, I mean making things the same. So there's this ideal of the nation state that's going on. If you dive into these studies, which it's a whole subset of historical studies, the problem here that you'll find is, number one, even in a place like France, even in a place like Spain, even in a place like Germany, there is tons of particularism. We aren't actually the same. If we stand way far away, yes, they all look the same. But as we zoom in, we find that Saxons don't think of themselves as Bavarians, and the language that's the dialect of German that's spoken in Prussia is different from the one that's spoken in Bavaria, and et cetera, and so on. And some of these persist to the present day. There is, for example, a secessionist movement in the Basque Catalonian region of Spain, for example. They don't think of themselves as Spanish. They don't want to be part of the Spanish state. There's an independence movement in Scotland, for example. Even though they've been part of the United Kingdom for longer than the United States has been a country. That's true. The big problem that we're going to see is here in Central Europe, in the Austrian lands, in the Empire of Austria here, because there's a very, very small German core. The Austrian Germans, they speak German, they are German, but they are ruling over a combination of Poles up here, Ukrainians over here, Slovenes down here, Croats down here. You can start to see the problem here, right? How do you form a nation state out of this? How do you standardize the language of this? And so the Habsburgs actually go in an entirely different direction. They try and say, okay, we're going to have autonomy, cultural autonomy for all of you. You can all have your own languages, all of your own rights. But this is going to cause a problem here, as we're going to see, because right here, you can see that in 1815, all of this, all of southeastern Europe here, is still controlled by the Ottoman Turks, okay? But as Turkish power wanes and recedes, you're going to get a lot of new states over here. The Christian populations, you're going to get Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, all states that we know today. But at the time, there's going to emerge a battle for influence in this region between Russia and Austria. And that is where the proximate cause of World War I comes from. As we will see, this process of state-making that takes place in the 19th century is in large part what produces World War I. Obviously, there are other factors. There are things like industrialization and the arms race. Previously, militaries were wound down. If a war started, it was like, okay, guys, we got to start building some ships and building more guns, and okay, draft the guys into the army, and we'll get things started. All of a sudden, technology starts changing at such a rapid pace. You almost have to be continually innovating and creating weapons. The training that goes along with those weapons. No longer is it just, well, you draft the kids off the farm and you hand them a bayoneted rifle. The rifle really doesn't fire that well, so we're pretty much just going to charge and try and stick them with bayonets. Don't need a lot of training for that. All of a sudden, weapons are becoming incredibly expensive, number one, and difficult to use. You need training and you need practice. And so this is another thing that's going to really give a boost to efforts by the state to educate its citizens. Because you need them to be able to read like a training manual, for example, to follow complex instructions. Industrialization, which is what a large part of our chapter today concerns. Again, it's better to have a population that is literate and numerate. I'm not talking about some kind of super advanced education here, and we kind of take this stuff for granted, but being able to read basic instructions and do basic maths is such a fundamental part of life. I know now we all have our little pocket calculator. I know when I was a kid and we were learning our basic sums in first and second grade and stuff, I remember we'd always be like, can't we just use a calculator? And the teacher would always say the same thing. You guys are young enough that you grew up with smartphones, but they'd always tell us the same thing. They say, it's not like when you grow up, you're always going to have a calculator in your pocket, Joe. Of course, no, that just goes to show. You never know. But yes, so these are all things that are going to be really critical in kind of fusing together. That's why I don't want you to think of this as like a monocausal thing. It's not. Very few events in history are ever monocausal, the product of one cause. When we get to World War I want you to understand that it was a combination of all these processes. Of industrialization, of state making, and again, industrialization, urbanization. You have all these people coming off the farms into the cities. And remember, we talked about how life in the rural communities was very particular. You didn't need to really define or explain who you were. When you get into these cities, all of a sudden you're encountering loads of difference. No one is like you, and you need to have a way of explaining who you are. And one of the new identity markers that people seize upon, and which states often play upon, is nationalism. You don't know who you are? Sure you do. You're a good, loyal son of France. And if France needs anything, you know you'll do anything to protect her. And this is a very useful thing. And so this social nationalism, there is a definite measure of top-down nationalism to this. Yes, in the case of France, it was very revolutionary and stuff, But other states who are looking to copy this, it's coming top down. Nationalism is an elite project. It is a handful of elites who are then trying to nationalize the people underneath them. The peasantry are kind of like, what are you talking about? Italy. We live here. We grow these olives. We've done this for centuries. What are you talking about? It's a difficult project, and it's going to take the better part of a century. And it's often going to help when there's an outside invader that you can unify everyone against. Because, for example, in Italy, highly particulars. They still don't like each other terribly much. You know, like Genoese hate Pisans because 600 years ago, one of them sank another one of their ships. You know what I mean? Like, it's like that. There's a saying in Genoa: better a death in the house than a Pisan at the door. That's pretty intense. Like, really? You'd rather someone in your house die than get a visitor from Pisa? Okay. Pretty intense. But you have these occupiers. The Austrians, we're going to see, are going to be occupying Italy. The hated Habsburgs, the Austrians. So this is going to provide a really great catalyzing force for the Italian nationalist revolutionaries. Because they're going to be able to say, look, we're not so different, you and I. Look who's ruling over us. And again, it's, a question of, well, the two of us, we may have our differences, but certainly we're both against them, who are much more different than us. So that's what we're doing the next couple weeks. Because yes, I've told you I'm not going to make it a Eurocentric story. I have tried to incorporate the other parts of the globe where I could, and where necessary, and where appropriate. However, now the story is going to get very Eurocentric. Because the world we live in today was made by World War II. World War II was made by World War I. World War I was made by the competing European nation states and empires, which formed during the 19th century. So, there you go. All right, let's do it. I'm going to erase this. Do you have any questions? No questions. If you do have questions and you do not like talking in class, you are more than welcome, of course, to email. Okay, so here's our map. Here's our map of Congress of Vienna. Napoleon defeated, 1814, exiled to the island of Elba, right here. You can see, you can't really see it on the map, but it's like right here. It's this tiny little island off the coast of Italy. We're never going to see him again, right? The Bourbons come back to France. They tell everyone, hey, I hope you enjoyed your period of meritocracy and revolution and stuff, because now everything's going back to the way it was. And there's nothing you can do about it, right? No, the people hate this. They hate the new monarchy. Napoleon hears about it, and he comes back. All the armies sent to stop him defect promptly to Napoleon's side. They have the 100 Days campaign, and he's finally defeated at Waterloo. Right up here, the 100 Days. So 1815, then they send Napoleon way down to St. Helena, which is way down in the South Atlantic, where he dies several years later. The Bourbons are back. They're in basically this shape here. France had expanded out. These are like what are called the natural frontiers, and it's the Pyrenees here, Pyrenees Mountains here. This is one of the reasons that Spain is going to be increasingly left out of our story, is Spain does not industrialize and liberalize and create an effective nation state or hold on to an empire the way that these other states do. Spain, part of it is the geography. I guess I'll just get rid of Spain here right now while I'm talking about it. I'm going to stop talking about Spain until World War II. I'll talk briefly about the Spanish Civil War, which is really kind of the prelude to World War II in Europe. Essentially, in Spain, if you remember, Napoleon had tried to put his brother on the throne. The Spanish had said, no way, no thanks. And they had a guerrilla war. After Napoleon is defeated, the Bourbons come back, and they, just like the Bourbons in France, had tried to restore absolute monarchy. Of course, there was a revolt against them, and they wind up having to settle for constitutional rule eventually. But there are a lot of divisions in Spain, and it's incredibly mountainous,
and rugged, like in a way that's difficult for me to explain. Look at a topographical map of Spain. It makes Italy look relatively flat, which Italy is not flat at all. It's just very, very difficult to go and subdue people who are being resistant to your centralizing efforts, right? We talked about this being the home of guerrilla warfare. It's because it's very difficult to get armies lined up in a flat area to just battle it out. And if you are a smaller, like, guerrilla paramilitary force who doesn't want to come out and fight, it's very easy for you not to, and to hold up in the mountains and be impossible to get rid of. And that's exactly what the problem you have here. You also have a division between the royal families. You have a series of what are called Carlist Wars. There are 3 of them. Basically what happens is there's a king. It's the Bourbon king who gets put back on the throne. He doesn't have a son. He has a daughter. Now, in the Bourbon royal line, women could not inherit. Now, previously, up until 1715, the War of the Spanish Succession, a Habsburg had been ruling Spain. Now, the Habsburgs, you could have a woman inherit, okay? But so, basically, the King of Spain at the time says, look, I'm just going to change the law so that my daughter can inherit the throne. No problem. It was done for centuries. No big deal, right? Well, his brother, the guy who would have inherited the throne, Don Carlos, that's why they're called the Carlists. They are the supporters of Don Carlos. They say, no way. He says, no way. They revolt. They have a nice bloody civil war. That's the first Carlos War. Then there's another Carlos War and another Carlos War. And they don't stop killing each other until like the 1870s. As you might expect, this seriously retards the state-making process. It seriously holds back economic development because you basically just have lots of civil war, which is not good for economic development or nation building. So, and Spain is horribly weakened by that point. They have no territories, no colonies. They wind up getting into a brush-up with the United States. The United States is super on the make by that point. There's all sorts of writing in the European press about the American peril. That America is this looming colossus over there, and we better hope it doesn't wake up. Well, in 1898, the Americans fight the Spanish and just thrash them and take away the last of their colonies. And then Spain goes through a period of like really intense soul searching, like who are we? You know, they're looking out the metaphorical window. Who are we? We were this great empire, and now look at us, we're a laughing stock. And yeah, and that basically goes on until there's battles between like the socialists and anarchists who basically want to use the lack of an existing strong state in Spain to basically create like an anarcho-syndicalist utopia. This is where like workers essentially own the factories. It's basically socialism. Then you have like hardcore Catholics and conservatives who are like, no way, and so they fight a lot. And eventually there's a civil war. That's the civil war that Orwell fights in. It's the one that Hemingway writes about in For Whom the Bell Tolls. And it ends with the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, which will persist into the 1970s. And that's Spain. They don't take part in World War I. They don't take part in World War II. They just are not going to matter to our story. And so that's Spain. There you go. If you want a nice, popular history book, remember when I say popular, I don't mean like, whoa, New York Times bestseller. I mean that they write it in a way that, like, a person who's just learning about Spain can read it and not feel like, oh my god, too many names and dates and stuff. I will give you one. It's an interesting country. But yeah, there you go, Spain. Okay, now we're going to go to the countries that really matter. France, Great Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, although the Holy Roman Empire, remember, was smashed and destroyed in 1806, so I have to stop saying that. So it's not the Holy Roman Empire anymore. Holy Roman Empire, gone, 1806, destroyed. Now what we have is the German Confederation. The German Confederation. I kind of skipped over this part, but when Napoleon destroys the Holy Roman Empire, technically it destroys itself, the emperor realizes Napoleon is going to defeat him and take his crown and crown himself Holy Roman Empire. And so in order to prevent that happening, he just says, actually, I dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. It doesn't exist anymore, so he can't be emperor of it. Boom, gotcha, Napoleon. And Napoleon was a little peeved by that. And actually, there would be like legal debates in the courts. The Holy Roman Empire was incredibly litigious, far more litigious than us.
Like, is the emperor really even allowed to do that? You know, they're like having court cases as the cannonballs are flying, you know. So, but Napoleon comes in and he says, okay, I'm going to reorganize this. Because remember, the Holy Roman Empire was like a bajillion tiny little states all arguing with each other, terribly ineffective. Napoleon says, we're going to take you small states and we're going to just suck you up into bigger states. So now, instead of 300 territorial states, we have about 16. And he called this the Confederation of the Rhine. After the war is over, the major states who exist now, we're talking about Bavaria, Saxony, this is Prussia. This is Prussia right here. You see this blue one? Keep an eye on them, because they're the ones who are going to make Germany in 50 years. They're the guys who are descendant from the Teutonic Knights who would fight in this area right here, Christianizing the populations of this area. These are some of the last pagans in Europe here, right here in Latvia, Lithuania, modern day Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. But they keep this structure because they realize, wow, look how much easier economic activity and planning is when you only have to get agreement from like 12 people instead of 300. Remember we talked about how they called together the Diet, the German Diet, which was just their Congress. And it's like, just imagine if you had to get like 300 people to agree on something. It's never going to happen, right? Now all of a sudden, there's just like 12 of them. It's just a lot easier to get things done. And they wind up creating a nice free trade zone. They create a nice free trade zone here. And the idea here is that if you remove the barriers to trade, it's going to make more trade between states. This is going to increase economic output. Remember, this is the period when, for all world history, economic output was like this. You know, it was like a flat line. This is the period, 1800. This is the period when all of a sudden it's just going to go parabolic, and it's never stopped. This is the point that they call takeoff in the literature, the takeoff point, where growth became cumulative and self-sustaining. There are reasons for that, but one reason is increased trade. Remember, one of the projects of the revolutionaries was to tear down the barriers to internal trade in France. Remember we said if you were growing some grapes here or had some extra wine from a harvest and you wanted to go over here where there isn't any wine and sell it, you would have to pay numerous taxes and tolls and fees as you crossed France. By the time you got to where you wanted to sell the wine, you had no possibility of making any money. So why grow any surplus? Why try and, accumulate capital? No point. It's just going to get taxed away. They're doing away with all of this. Other states are doing the same. In Germany, that's the idea here is, okay, stop taxing us every time we try and do a little bit of trade. Just do one tax at the end. Just let the trade happen and then tax the end product. And this is incredibly successful. It's called the Zollverein. And the Zollverein, if you look at who is a member of the Zollverein in the German Confederation, these are the states that eventually become Germany. And this was kind of the idea of the European Union. Are you guys familiar with the European Union, the EU? You guys hear about it in the news? Yeah? Anybody? European Union? Okay. That was the idea of the European Union. The idea was, look, we should join together, but nobody wants to join together politically yet. So what we'll do is we'll join together economically first. And after a long period of economic union, political union will naturally follow. These were the discussions that were had in the 80s and 90s when they were making the European Union, when they were signing the Treaty of Maastricht. That was the idea, was that economic union first, political union will follow. Look, it happened in Germany, and Germany is going to be an incredible success story. So that's what's going on there. Industrialization. So small l, liberalization. Liberalization, representative bodies, parliaments, congresses, things to vote the taxes. The reason for this being, people will work harder if they feel more secure
in their ability to protect their incomes. All right? We talked about this in the context of one of our previous lectures, where we talked about, look, you've got your land. You're not going to make improvements on your land if some ruler can just send some tax agents out and arbitrarily just take away what you did. You're not going to work hard to improve stuff. That stuff's just going to be looted, taken away by the state. Representative bodies and constitutions. Protections, and limitations on the ability of the state to tax you. These are going to be huge boosts to economic growth, because at the same time, you have liberalization, which also lower taxes, less regulations, no tariffs. Remember, these have been the policies of the empires practicing mercantilism. Mercantilism. We mentioned mercantilism. Basically, the old way of doing things, someone like Louis the Mercantilism, the old idea of someone like Louis XIV and his ministers was, well, there's only a little bit of stuff in the world. And so we want to just pull it all inside of France and then lock it up and not let anybody have it. And that way we'll be the richest. They viewed economics as win-lose. People like the most famous one, he was not the first, I want to be clear, but he's the most famous, Adam Smith, a Scottish moral philosopher and proto-economist, writes this book called The Wealth of Nations, where he shows that actually, if we trade with each other, economics becomes win-win. When you trade something that you don't want, that I do want, for something that you want that I have that I don't want, we're both better off. And if we just do this a whole bunch of times, we'll all be way better off. He says, also, we need to get rid of these things called guilds. Guilds were like closed shop labor unions. Let's say you wanted to be a shoemaker. You are phenomenal. You are like a naturally phenomenal shoemaker. And you have some great ideas for how to make shoes newer and better. Problem is, you're not a member of the shoemaking guild. So you can't make shoes. It's against the law. And you go to them and you say, I'd like to be in the guild. I have these ideas, you know. And they're like, well, we already have too many shoemakers, so sorry. And that was it. You couldn't make shoes. End of discussion. Guild status was oftentimes inherited, passed from father to son. Imagine your dad has a union card, and there's only a handful of union cards, and when he dies, he gives it to you, so you can be in the union and have that good job. That's what's going on here. Adam Smith is saying, no. This is silly. We need free entry. We need open shops. If you know how to make shoes, make some shoes. Because the more people who make shoes, the lower the cost of shoes, the more people can afford shoes. And if they're spending less money on shoes, they'll have more money to spend on things like plates, or shirts, or hats, or gloves, or forks, whatever. The point is, you want to lower the cost of things. And to lower the cost of things, you need to have people making more of things. So you don't want restrictions on people making stuff, which is what the guild system was. He says, too, listen, the guilds were made of master craftsmen. So if you made shoes, you would literally cut out the sole, then you'd go cut out the leather, you'd stretch the leather, just like this, mind you, and then you'd take your awl and you'd punch the holes for the laces, and then you would stitch the uppers to the lowers. Adam Smith says, no. You want to have one guy whose only job is to cut out the soles. Think about how many soles he can cut out very fast. He then slides them over to a guy who's cutting out the uppers. And you create an assembly line. And he called it specialization. He said, you want labor specialization. He says, look, I understand that the job will be a little bit more boring, because instead of like doing all the different parts and making one single thing, you're just doing one task over and over and over. He acknowledges that this will be boring, but he says, look, we can make way more stuff this way. And this is the idea of the factory system. No longer do you have one guy sitting in a shop making maybe 3 pairs of shoes in an afternoon. Now you have a factory with an assembly line of people churning out thousands of shoes in a day. Again, this is something that's going to make all of us better off, because the more shoes there are, the lower the cost of the shoes, the more shoes we can have, and the more money we have left over to buy other things. And Adam Smith says, look, don't feel bad for the shoemakers okay? Because we have 100 little shops making 3 pairs of shoes a day. Instead, you set up a factory that makes 1,000 shoes using 10 guys. Don't feel bad for all those other people who can't make shoes anymore because they can't compete. They'll just go start new businesses, doing other things. And now we'll all have more money to give them for their new products. This is why capitalism and free trade and liberalism is highly disruptive. It is highly disruptive. This is a process that Joseph Schumpeter, a later Austrian economist, not Austrian school economist, just an economist from Austria, he called this process creative destruction. He said, look, capitalism and freedom is all about letting people try new things. And if something old is no longer desired and not working and not efficient, it will be scrapped and something better will take its place. And we don't want the government stepping in and saying, whoa, 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 we're going to give them subsidies or protection. Subsidy just means the government takes some of your money and gives it to someone because they are not competing efficiently in the market, by the way. That is what that means. So this is what's going on even back then. One of the things that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who eventually becomes ruler of France, he says, look, we need free trade with England. It'll be better for us. But the French manufacturers get together in a lobby, basically, and say, no, don't do that. That'll put so much economic pressure on us because the English are so much better at making products than us. And he says, well, guys, as your humble dictator, I'm going to do it anyway, and you will get more efficient at making stuff. Or you will not, and you'll go out of business, and we'll buy English stuff, and you'll make something different. So that's those are the debates. The more things change, the more things stay the same. So, creative destruction, the move to capitalism. Capitalism. It's not mine. I can tell. There it is. And industrialization. So not only do we have this new way of producing things via capitalism and freedom and free exchange, we also have industrialization. Industrialization means now not only are we putting together factories and having specialization and open competition and trade, we're doing it using things like steam power. Now, steam power, you're probably steam, what's the big deal? You put a pot of water on the stove, steam. Think of it as like electricity before electricity. It could make stuff move. You know what I mean? Like you could power machines with steam. So yes, obviously now we use electricity and things like that, but this was a way to basically create machines that did the work for you. Obviously, there had been efforts prior to this. A lot of times you'd see a lot of economic activity along the major rivers, and this is because in the medieval period they realized, hey, if we connect a water wheel to the side of this thing, the water flowing will turn this thing, and we can create a series of gears and levers, and it will turn things, and it will make like a loom. You know what a loom is? Like make clothes. You guys ever seen a loom? Yeah? Okay. My daughter got like a mini loom, is like making like clothes and stuff. It's like a rack, and you stretch the fabric along it, and you weave stuff like this, right? It's a little time consuming though. They figured out that, whoa, you know what? If we just connect all these moving pieces to the water wheel and the gears, it will move itself. So there had been things before like machines, but nothing like this. Industrialization, when they start using steam power, and coal, and very quickly electricity. Electricity is not long in coming. Mind you, the reason that the 19th century is so troubled is because you have tons of change. I mean, just think about it. In 1815, when Napoleon's defeated, you have still the fastest way of getting things to people is by horseback. The best machine anyone can really make is maybe using a very small steam engine to pump the water out of a mine or something like that. By the 1850s and 1860s, You have coal-fired plants, you have telegraph wires all over the place, you have undersea telegraph cables being laid, where you can literally communicate across continents going underwater with a cable. So again, just imagine this amount of changes here. You went from guild system, closed shop stuff to like anyone can make anything they want. Most people are living on the farm. People are flooding into the cities to get jobs at these new factories. This is an incredible amount of changes to be jamming into a very, very short amount of time. The rate of change in Europe prior to this had looked a lot like the growth curve, right? It was like this. The amount of change that's going on in European society looks like this. It's basically zero. You know, oh, they privatized a little bit of land, a little bump there, oh, peasant revolution there. But now all of a sudden changes are happening at an exponential pace. At an exponential pace. So I'm going to erase this and keep going. All right. Because the reason it's troubled is, yes, all of these things are happening and all of them wind up producing a lot of really great things and definitely improving our standard of living. The middle class is emerging and growing, but it's also creating a lot of social problems because this process did not happen cleanly. Okay, the entrenched interests who are losing market share, losing money because of free trade, the people who are being pushed out of their jobs, these skilled artisans, these people who had like a status in society, that like they were a master craftsman. All of a sudden, they're being displaced and put out of business by some dudes who can barely cut a piece of leather. You know, it's degrading, it's alienating, and it's causing a lot of problems, especially because farming is also getting more efficient. We talked about using Enlightenment ideas. We talked about using the rationalism, the ideas of the Enlightenment, using human knowledge to make things better and easier. Well, they're applying this to things like farming. And people are getting pushed off the farm. So you have your city here, you have your city, and then you have your outlying lands, which are all farms, right? As farming gets more efficient, you need fewer people to farm. So where do they go? They go into the cities looking for work, right? Now, number one. Industrialization is still in its infancy. Okay, so we're in the 1820s and 1830s. Industrialization and the growth of factories and things like that it's really just starting. So it's not easy to absorb all of these people who are coming from the countryside. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who are flooding into cities like Lyon, Marseille, Paris, okay? So you have, and so that's, okay, at the best of times it's difficult. At the best of times it's difficult to find jobs for all of these people. If there's any kind of economic slowdown, which as you all know from being alive and just kind of observing events, you know that sometimes the economy goes down, right? And when it goes down, what happens to the jobs? There's fewer of them, right? The unemployment rate goes up. Now, today we have things like unemployment and welfare benefits and things like that. Back then, there was not. You had a job at a factory, you were showing up, getting paid at the factory, and then one day you showed up and the boss was like, yeah, you're all fired. I'm closing up the factory until better economic times come around. I'm just going to hole up and wait this out. You're all unemployed now. Thank you very much. Come see me when things have turned around. You now have no job, and you have no money, you have no food, and you probably are about to get booted out of wherever you're living. So you wind up in periods like the 1840s, for example, when a really big downturn comes. It's kind of one of the first big recognizable business cycles that we've all gotten kind of used to occurring now. This is one of the first big ones. You're going to get mass unemployment. And hungry people in the streets. So if you have unemployed, hungry people in the streets, that's going to be bad for you. It's going to be bad for any regime. And you have these periodic downturns because when you're on the farm, this is critical to think about. For most human history, 99.9% of us were farmers, and we grew and ate what was on the farm. Now, as long as no like marauding soldiers came through and took our stuff, we were going to be fine. And maybe the idea of like an economy like that didn't really make sense. That's why there wasn't like a profession of economics. Economics, until the last couple centuries, meant home economics. Anyone read Wendell Berry? Home economics. It's how to manage your home. Home economics. So when they talk about economics, they meant, being sensible and planting the right number of crops and making sure that you have enough to get you through the winter. It meant managing your own household. We grew what we needed, we consumed what we needed, and in the spring, we planted our seed corn, or whatever we had left over from last year, and then we started the process again. Maybe during the winter, if you were a decent carpenter, you could build a chair and sell that to someone locally who wanted a chair. It was called the cottage industry. Your wife was maybe like really good at knitting gloves, and so maybe like during the winter when you're all stuck inside, she could knit some gloves. You could sell those maybe. Very, very small markets here. Very little economic activity going on. Home economics. All of a sudden, you start to have the creation of national economies, where a bad harvest in one part of the country can really be bad because so many people are moving off the farms, where all of a sudden, whether or not the business cycle is up or down, it doesn't even exist. It doesn't matter. What's going on in other places doesn't matter. We have our food here. We have our church right down the road, and that's pretty much our lives. All of a sudden, you have tons of people living in the cities who don't grow their own food. And if there's an economic downturn and they're unemployed, it's not like they can just be like, well, no problem, I'll go outside and eat one of these potatoes that I grew. They're not growing any potatoes. They're engaged in wage labor, mass wage labor. Industrialization brings with it wage labor, mass wage labor. From everyone being basically subsistence farmers, meaning you grow what you need to eat, you and your family, subsistence farmer, a society of subsistence farmers, to a society of workers / consumers. No longer do you work to make your food, now you work to make money. And with that money, you can use a part of it to buy food. Now, again, this is no problem as long as you keep making money. In fact, it's a good thing if not all of us are growing food, right? Because then we have the ability to have some people be doctors and lawyers and pizza makers and all the different things that we have today. There's actually a whole school of economics that looks at a country's development, and what they do is they say, okay, we can tell how developed your economy is by looking at 1, 2, 3 sectors. Sector 1 is agriculture. How many people do you need to grow the food to keep your country alive? If the number is very high, we are looking at a not very developed country. The second sector, industry. How many people are engaged in manufacturing, making stuff? Number 3, this is why they're called tertiary occupations, by the way. Service sector, tertiary occupations. The idea being, if you have the majority of your people here in tertiary occupations doing things like making pizzas, doing your taxes, being masseuses or shoe salesmen or whatever the case may be, that means that you have reached a high level of development where you can use robots and machinery to do most of your growing and most of your manufacturing. So we're at this period where we're transitioning to this. Okay? And it's highly disruptive because this, I want to reiterate, is how most of us, 99.9% of us, have lived since the time of the Romans. So we are in the process here in the 19th century of dismantling a way of life that had been around for millennia. It's highly disruptive. There is going to eventually be a huge blow because, like I said, this is all happening very rapidly. A lot of changes are happening at once. And if anything goes wrong, anything big goes wrong, there's going to be an explosion. Something does go wrong in the 1840s. Because in the 1840s, something terrible happens, especially if you're Irish. Anybody here Irish or have Irish ancestry? Me too. Okay. Down with the English. Potato blight, potato famine. Potatoes, you all remember, were brought back from the Americas, part of the Columbian Exchange. And the Europeans seized upon them, especially the poor ones, because holy smokes, these things are like indestructible. You just take one and throw it in the ground and it grows more of them. You don't have to do anything, right? If any of you have never tried that, like just take a potato from the store, dig a hole in your backyard, chuck it in there, and like it'll just grow potatoes. You don't have to do anything. I'm terrible at gardening, and even I can grow potatoes. And they're like hardy and indestructible. They're not like particularly like nutrient diverse, but you know, it's okay in a pinch. It's okay in a pinch. People of this time period were much shorter and lighter than we are today because of their lack of nutritional diversity, by the way. So like the average, like you read like military manuals and it's like, to be a French soldier, you must be the striking height of 5'1". You know, and you're like, what? It's like, yeah, that was so the idea that Napoleon was like really super short, it's just not true. Like, yes, by modern standards, he was not particularly tall, but by the standards of his day, he was a normal-sized man. So just a side note there about nutrition and the importance of eating healthy. The potato blight. The potato blight. What was the potato blight? Well, it was a disease that affected the potato crop, ruined them, made them inedible, and it wipes out large parts of the potato crop in places all over Europe. Now, it was particularly bad in Ireland, and the reason it's associated so strongly with Ireland is because Ireland was so poor and so dependent on the potato. Ireland was England's first colony, and it was never treated particularly well, and they were all pretty super duper poor, and they lived on potatoes, and so when your one crop is destroyed, things are not going to be good. Now, the thing is though, so there are potato crops across Europe, and these do get destroyed. These do get destroyed, but the real problem here is related to free markets, to capitalism, okay? Because there are what are called substitute goods, okay? And this is part of what's called the commercial revolution. We have all sorts of revolutions going on in the 19th century. There's actually a book called The Age of Revolutions, because you have the Industrial Revolution, you have the Political Revolution, you have the Commercial Revolution, you just have all sorts of things happen. You get the idea, looking at the 19th century, that things are happening. Things are going crazy. The Commercial Revolution basically meant that all things are now going to be for sale. It's the birth of the marketplace. Remember, I mentioned that if you were a young noble and you inherited your father's land, all right, sweet. I need a little cash. I'm going to liquidate these lands. Could you sell it? No, you could not. Because you didn't own it in that way. You were more of a steward. You were basically coming into this land and taking care of it to pass it on to the next generation. You couldn't just like break up the land and sell it. That wasn't how it worked. It was not legal to do that. There had to be a series of laws passed to make land saleable in a lot of these instances. This is the period when everything is going up for sale, and the market will determine the prices. That's why it's called the Commercial Revolution. Substitute goods. The way this works, it means that I like red shirts. My primary consumption of clothing is red shirts. It's not true. Most of my class is blue, I think, but red. I love red shirts. However, in a pinch, if there are no red shirts, I can easily substitute them with a yellow shirt. Right? Now, what happens if all the red shirts are gone? What happens to the prices of all the other shirts? They go up, right? So, in the economy of the 19th century, potatoes, for example, potatoes are a good, and wheat is a good, and we would call them substitute goods, because they both fulfill the same function. You wear the yellow shirt, you wear the red shirt, you eat the potato, you eat the wheat. So now that potatoes are all gone, not literally all gone, but like tons of them are all gone, the price of all substitute goods, wheat, barley, you name it, the price of all the other food items skyrocket. So when we talk about the hungry 40s in Europe that are going to help spark the major revolutions of 1848, right here, that are just going to smash the whole system to pieces. The revolutions of 1848, masses of hungry, starving people are going to be a huge part of the problem. And it's not that there's no food, it's that what food there is insanely expensive. And the new wage-earning working class have very small wages, and now all of a sudden, the price of food is zooming, and no one can understand why. No one can understand why. And again, to the modern mind, it's like, well, duh, you just lost a bunch of crops, so the prices of all the other crops go up, right? No, to them, it's like these wicked people. It might be the king, maybe because they're still monarchs. They're parliamentary monarchs now, but like it must be the king doing it, or these wicked merchants, or some sort of conspiracy. No. Boss baby. My kids are just watching it. So this is going to cause problems. For example, you are taking your crop. You've got a nice bumper crop here of wheat, and you've heard here in the village, you've heard, oh my gosh, in town, in the nearest city, let's say in Lyon or Paris or wherever, people are starving and they will pay 3 times the amount what people will pay here. I'm going to load my stuff on my wagon and take it to Paris to sell it. There are countless stories of these travelers being stopped from leaving town. Like, whoa, what are you doing? Like, we need that food here. And it's like, no, you see, this is my food. I grew it, and I'm going to take it where I can sell it for more. And it's like, no, but we're hungry here. Like, you live here, you grew the food here, you sell it here. So there's this old mentality of thinking running up against this new mentality of thinking. Spoiler alert, most of the time the choice was we will either bash your head into your neighbor or you can sell it to us. And so they did the smart thing, sold it to them. But so just old ways of thinking running into new ways of thinking here. So capitalism, industrialization, free trade, all of these things are going to make us richer. But anytime you have old structures being destroyed, you're disrupting the old way of doing things. There's going to be people who fight this. Of course, people like the skilled artisans who are of the guild tradition. You're going to have the old landed elites, the descendants of the old noble families who are fighting this because, of course, this new way of making money is only going to further increase the power of the bourgeoisie. Now, this is just a fancy way of saying, this is the French word because everything has to be French. This is just a fancy way of saying basically the middle class. These are the people who run the businesses, including factories. In fact, Karl Marx is writing during this period. He distinguished, he called so he had the bourgeoisie, which were the property owners. You own a house and a business and all these things. You're just what we would call an ordinarily successful person. But remember, everyone had been like peasants and poor, landless, possessionless laborers, and then you had the people with all the property and money. This is where it's all kind of shifting and merging together. And you have the bourgeoisie. These are the people who are really successful at playing the new game. All of a sudden, they have freedom to do things. They've been released from the bonds of the old order. They can go out and acquire property and start businesses and stuff. The people who are super successful at doing that, that's the bourgeoisie. And the people who are super successful at doing that, Marx called them the haute bourgeoisie, meaning like the big bourgeoisie. These are the ones who are really successful, who start the massive factories or are really successful in finance or banking or something like that. So these new states that are going to be created are going to be dominated by the bourgeoisie. The 19th century is the beginning of rule by the bourgeoisie. They like to rule via constitutional assemblies, but they don't want anyone in there who's not one of them. So as these states are democratizing, what they really want are limited parliamentary monarchies. That's what all of them want. If you remember back to the French Revolution, that's what the original French revolutionaries wanted. They didn't want everyone voting on things. They said, no, look, king, we have the money, but none of the political power. So those of us who have the money, you should let us take part in the government like the English do. And the king was like, that sounds terrible. I don't think so. And they said, okay, and the revolution happens. This is the goal, though, of the bourgeoisie. And so an interesting thing is going to happen. A really interesting thing is going to happen. Because the bourgeoisie are a minority. Yes, up here it's true. You still have the old nobility who are holding on to power as best they can. And some of them are going into business and stuff. But they still control a decent amount of the political power. What's going to happen, and I'll use the example of France, since you're already familiar with France from the French Revolution, and I don't have time to introduce something crazy like Germany. Sorry, not Germany yet. Something like Prussia or Austria, which is even more complicated. What's going to happen is, in their attempt to make a limited parliamentary monarchy, the bourgeoisie, I'll draw a class pyramid. Because it's easier maybe to visualize this way. So you have the class pyramid. At the bottom here, you have the peasants and landless, I'm going to write propertyless. The propertyless wage laborers. These form the majority of society. Okay? Above them now, and I can see that I drew this pyramid far too funkily. I should have made it wider at the base. Here we go. I'm going to redraw it. So at the bottom here, you have all these people. This is the majority of society. The peasants live out in the countryside. A lot of them have like their own small farms, and they're basically engaging in like subsistence farming. There are some larger farms that are more efficient and stuff. At the very top here, you have the old order. You have like the king and the major nobility who are trying to hold on to political power. We have this middle class here. Now, the thing about the king and the major nobility is they control the bureaucracy and the army. Now, these are two not inconsiderable things to be controlling if you're trying to keep hold of power. They got the army, they got the guys with the guns, and they got the guys who can pull the taxes out of the society to pay the guys with the guns. So, very useful things to have. This middle class, the bourgeoisie, I'll just call them the middle class, what they're trying to do is they're trying to take these guys' place. That's what they want to do. They want to put themselves on top of society. Because they look at people like the king and the old nobility sitting on their country estates, and it's like, you guys literally contribute nothing to society. We are the nation. We make the stuff. We run the companies. We pay the taxes. It's us. We do everything. We should be the ones in charge, obviously. You guys literally do nothing. You're a useless class. About that, Marx and the middle class were both in agreement that those guys were just useless parasites. Now the problem is, the middle class is not the majority and they don't have an army. So what do? They turn to the poor, laboring classes and they say, guys, isn't this just the most unfair stuff that's going on? This is just outrageous, don't you think? Basically, they stir up the lower classes to use against the ruling class. And in the cities, this is particularly the case. Okay? So in the 1840s, when the people are hungry and starving and governments don't really know how to handle it, it's actually interesting. You hear about things today like public works programs and like food handouts and stuff. The French government was like kind of trying that stuff. They just didn't really have like the resources or bureaucracy to like do it very well. But they actually like set up like some like national workshops where you could like go in if you didn't have a job and you could like just do like a made up job for the day. and they'd give you enough money to like buy some bread. So they were trying to, like, modern problems require modern solutions, right? They were trying to come up with solutions to this very unusual problem of having these, million hungry people here in Paris. Like, sir, what do we do with all these people? It's like, I don't know why aren't they on their farm making food? I don't know. They're all wageless labor, wage laborers who don't have a job. In the 1840s, the middle class seizes upon this opportunity. They say, look, the people are out in the streets, they're agitated, they're all stirred up. We'll use them against the king and extract concessions from them, right? Basically put the king in a little box, parliamentary monarchy, right? The British monarch, who is still there, but they're useless, right? They're what's called dignified. The English kings and queens were dignified. That meant it's like a nice way of saying, you're the head of state, you represent us in a metaphorical kind of way, but you have nothing to do with the actual affairs of government. That's what all of these middle class people, this is what all the leading middle class people want to do. Because remember, England is the most successful state in the world at this point. So everyone is looking at English constitutionalism and free trade and liberalism and parliamentary monarchy and saying, well, if we want to copy the British, we need to copy the British, we need to do that. That's what we need to do. And so that is exactly what happens. Now, this happens multiple times. I'm pointing out 1848 because 1848 is the big explosion. This is when it happens all across Europe. It happens in Austria, it happens in Prussia. Actually, in Austria, it's so bad, they have to call the Russians in to like put down the Hungarians. I won't get into that. But this happens all across Europe, okay? All at the same time, like right at the start of 1848, there's like an initial explosion of violence in Paris, and then within weeks, all of Europe is like in turmoil. Eventually, the monarchies are able to reassert control, albeit a lot of times with concessions to the middle class. It had happened in France in the 1830s. That's when they got rid of the Bourbon kings who had been brought back with them, and they bring in Louis Philippe, who promises to rule as a constitutional monarch, but he doesn't do a very good job. And in 1848, they throw him off as well. And what happens in both cases is this. You have, let's just call, how do I want to draw this out? Because I feel like drawing it will be better. So you have the middle class, the lower class, and the ruling class. Okay. The middle class needs the numbers and power of the lower class. But the lower class is numerous as they are illiterate and poor and landless. And so they don't actually want, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, does not actually want them in government. They are not fighting for universal suffrage and democracy and stuff. They hate democracy. Democracy is the rule by the many and the uneducated and the landless and the poor. They want government by themselves. Like the British, they want the owners of the country. The idea here is the people who own the country are the ones who pay for the country. They own the land and they pay the taxes. They are the owners of the country, so they should be running the country. They want to use the power and energy of the lower class to get concessions, basically to neutralize the ruling class, to let them be in power. But then once they're in power, once the bourgeoisie is in power, they want to then turn on the lower class and smash them back into submission. Who's seen Les Mis or read Les Mis? At the end, when the young guy, I forget his name, dies, he gets shot. Or, does he die? I don't remember. You all said you didn't see it anyway. Well, okay, that's a famous example. But basically, what will happen is once they stir them up and get the regime to give them the concessions that they want, well, it's hard to then be like, okay, lower classes, we won. None of you have votes, and nothing changes for you. You need to go back to work. But we're going to run things now, and we promise, in the future, things will be much better managed now that we're in charge. That's not going to settle things down. You have to deploy the army against them, and that's what they do. They send the army out into the streets to, like, pacify the city, right? And at the end of Les Mis, that's what they're doing. They're shooting all the young revolutionaries who are no longer useful to them. And so you have this very interesting thing. You have the middle class align with the lower class to get rid of the privileges of the upper class. But then once they get what they want, they basically use the resources and tools and collaborators of the upper class against their former partners in the lower class. Because we are used to talking about liberal, capitalist, democracy, right? We're all used to hearing these words all strung together: liberal capitalist democracy, liberal capitalist democracy. In the 19th century, these were understood to be mutually exclusive. That democracy was just the slow, dignified road to socialism and communism. Because obviously, the many, being the poor and the landless, if we give them the vote, they'll just vote to take away the stuff from the other people and share it among themselves. And that will destroy the basis of all society. And so, they wanted to keep the lower classes from getting the vote. Now, it turned out that they were actually kind of wrong about that. Because what happened is that over time, capitalism created a middle class, made people wealthy. It made the majority of people interested stakeholders in upholding the existing capitalist order. It's one of the 800 reasons that socialism and communism did not wind up conquering the world as theoreticians believed it would. So that's what's going on here. Actually, liberal capitalism, liberalism, the rights of assembly and speech and representative government and no taxation without representation, and capitalism, the freedom to make things yourself, to start businesses, to trade, to keep the products of your labor, to freely exchange them with others, that created so much wealth and such a broad base of wealth among society that you no longer had just a few people up top with a lot of stuff and everyone else on the bottom with like basically nothing as subsistence poor farmers. All of a sudden you have the growth of this massive middle class. So essentially, let's see, we're stopping at 1848. In the 1860s and 1870s is when you start seeing places like in England, they finally give the vote to all propertyless males, and it's actually the conservatives who do it. It's not the liberals. It's the old school monarchist conservative dudes who realize that actually these people love their God and king and are prosperous, and that we can give them the vote, they'll be just fine, and they do, and that is exactly what happens. The German government makes a similar calculation, and so ironically, it's not the liberal progressive types who are trying to advance society forward who give the vote to people. A lot of times it's actually the conservatives, because what you have in countries then, and this is what I'll leave you with, is you have the emergence of two parties, and I don't mean parties in like the modern political sense. I just mean more like factions among the ruling classes. You have the party of movement, which in England was called the Liberals. They actually did have parties. England was very advanced in democracy at that point, in democratic representation in institutions. Party of movement versus the party of power. And if you want to think of them as being kind of the reactionaries who are trying to stop further change, and the party of movement being the progressives who are trying to make changes, that's a pretty fair representation of what was going on. You have a clique of people who are saying, we need to do more industrialization, more liberalization, expand the franchise more to give more people votes because then they'll have more of a stake in government. And you have the party of power and reaction who are saying, no, that's just going to unleash the forces of social instability, and we've gone far enough, and it's actually dangerous how far we've gone, we need to actually roll things back. And so there's going to be a battle between these two factions, and that's pretty much it. A lot of times you'd have a head of state who is kind of mediating between them. We don't have any other states to talk about, so I'm just going to keep talking about France. Tuesday we'll unify Germany and Italy and stuff, and then we'll have other states that we can talk about, because it's too complicated to talk about them right now at a 100-level course, because there's just a million different moving parts. It's easier to just talk about France, because in France you have this party of movement, which is all of the liberal class, the middle class, and their allies in the nobility, because some of the nobility were actually very keen on liberalism. They were like, whoa, look at all the money you can make. Like this is not so bad. We want to actually get in on this. Because remember, if you were a noble, you actually were legally barred from going into business. You couldn't go into business. So some of them were actually really gung-ho about that. And then you had the party of power, the party of reaction, who said, no, we need to go back to the way things were. You'd oftentimes, to prevent violence between them, you'd basically have a dictator. In Germany, it was the Kaiser, which was the German word for Caesar. In Austria, we had the emperor. In France, they actually, and I'm not joking, they settle on Napoleon's nephew to be the leader And he basically he reigns for 17 years or something like that, and he creates the Second French Empire. So that is what is born out of 1848. You have this experiment in attempts at creating a parliamentary system. It's not quite successful, and they wind up really getting at loggerheads. There's too much fighting between these two, and Napoleon Jr., Louis Napoleon, the little Napoleon, is just kind of an acceptable choice among all of the liberals, because he's someone who has a mind toward progress. He actually probably believed a little too much in the inevitability of progress. It's what's going to lead him to support the Italian attempts at unification, which are going to blow up in his face. There's this idea among intellectuals at the time. Karl Marx is a great example of this. Karl Marx, author of the Communist Manifesto and all that stuff, Capital, he believed that history had an arc, that history was progressive, that it was moving toward a final end state, and that we were constantly improving to higher and higher states. And things like the creation of independent nation states were an inevitable mark of the progress of history. And this is something that is driving a lot of these people. It's what's going to drive thinkers in Washington. When you look at Washington reacting to things like this, they cheer German unification, which is totally ironic, right? Because then they will fight multiple world wars against the Germans. But at the time, they're like, yes, this is all part of the proper progress of history, that the German people have their own nation state. Everyone needs one of those. The Italians, Bulgarians, all of that. And so nationalism is going to be the great ideology that replaces everything. And I'll leave you with this. As all the old structures are being broken down, family, church, monarchy, as all these things are being destroyed, all these old identity markers are being destroyed, nationalism, love of the nation, is what's going to take its place. And Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a moral philosopher at the time, predicted that these new enlightened, progressive religious beliefs, that of nationalism, would be as destructive or more than the religious beliefs that they had replaced, and that they would lead to even more worse religious wars in the future. And if you want to think of the world wars as being kind of, about nationalism, about national ideology, then I think he was right. So I will leave you with that, and I will see you on Tuesday. The quiz for this week is up. It is almost all exclusively about the stuff we talked about Tuesday, about what's going on in the rest of the world, because we're going to be talking about Europe for the next several weeks. So I wanted to give them their due before we leave them until decolonization, basically.